Hi people, hope you're all well. The subject of this video is actually something a few subscribers have requested or suggested that I discuss, and it is something that I had actually uploaded. I'd spoken about the subject, but A, that video was a bit long, and B, I had to keep re-uploading that because I was trying to read out from a Yahoo News analysis of it, and it was a good report, but I just kept losing the screen. So I'm just starting afresh with this. Before I get into the main video, I want to make a disclaimer um, to YouTube because, frankly, with my experience of being penalized before, I feel very unfairly so. I just want to put it for the record. I am not spreading any fake news. I am not breaking any community guidelines. I'm not making any threats. I'm not showing any graphic content. I'm just reflecting on an issue that's already been widely reported. That's all. I mean, it's ridiculous, I have to say that, but honestly, the way YouTube treats creators these days, in my experience, that's I feel I have to make that disclaimer. Very briefly, on other news, those scenes from Kabul, it's really dramatic. I mean, people literally clinging onto planes and chaos at the airport. It's increasingly looking just like the fall of Saigon, which the US State Department is denying, but it's very easy to see the analogy there. And no doubt there'll be a lot of talking points around that. It means that Haiti, the other big story today, it's kind of been overshadowed. Major earthquake there, at least 1,300 dead. That figure's probably going to increase. It makes it actually the deadliest earthquake of this decade so far, and certainly the last thing that Haiti needs. So one could easily get depressed and think the world's just bad news. But I think you have to look at news in the sense of, well, you need to look at the world as a whole picture. Um, Unfortunately, dramatic, sad, violent, turbulent stories are probably more likely to make the news than good, uplifting stories. But that doesn't mean there aren't good, uplifting stories out there. And for my part, I might try to cover those more. But for the purpose of this video, to get to the point, what happened in Plymouth is awful. It's significant because it's the first mass shooting in Britain since the Cumbria shooting of 2010. Now, to put that in context, we see this sort of incident roughly once a decade. That's how rare it is in a country of 68 million people. So, people shouldn't look at what's happened in Plymouth, awful as it is, and think, oh, the situation's out of control. It's very, very important in these situations to look at the bigger picture in the sense of the fact that we don't have a serious gun problem in this country. I say that because there will be some Second Amendment Americans and others who want to come in and say, oh, this is why you Brits should have guns. That's crazy. Um, our gun laws are, for the most part, very effective. That's a fact. And it's a fact exemplified by the fact that highlighted by the fact, I should say, that we haven't had a school shooting since Dunblane in 1996 in a quarter of a century. Because the major government brought in a handgun ban after that. So I believe our gun policies are effective. The real question mark here in terms of the gun issue is why did Devon and Cornwall police reinstate this guy with his weapon? And why did he have a weapon in the first place? I mean, he lived in the city, Plymouth. You know, it's not like he was a farmer living in rural Devon. Um, Clearly there was a serious problem here in terms of vetting. I think when they reissued him with his firearm, I understand that he had it suspended because he was involved in an assault incident with a teenager. So when he had it suspended, before they even contemplate giving it back to him, they should have, checked out his background. And had they done a bit of research, they might have found out the sort of extreme material he was posting online, or at least had some indication that this guy was not mentally stable. And I think it's fair to maybe consider that aspect. Some people say, "Oh no, don't link mental illness," but I don't think you can totally divorce it either. Um, but clearly, someone like this shouldn't have had a weapon. In my opinion, the only people in this country who really should have a firearm or have any reason to have a firearm are farmers for obvious reasons to protect their livestock, licensed hunters, um, police officers, particularly in big metropolitan areas, for example, anti-terror officers. Um, and frankly, that's probably about it. Even soldiers aren't allowed, as far as I know, to bring their weapons home. You know, members of the armed forces can't just bring their weapons home from base. Um, I could be wrong about that, but that's my understanding. Perhaps Olympic pentathletes, because shooting's part of that, so they might have a licensed weapon. But really, we're an urban society. There's no reason for a British citizen to have a gun, unless it's one of the reasons I stated. So that needs to be looked at. I think it's a major blunder by Devon and Cornwall Police, and they need to answer to this. They've referred themselves to the police watchdog as they're obligated to do. So that's a practical issue. And I think police departments across the country, police forces across the country, need to look at if they are giving licenses for weapons, they need to be 100% sure that the people who they are, giving those licenses to, I assume it's the police that gives the license. I mean, this is the thing. It's such a small issue in this country, gun politics, that I don't even know, I honestly don't even know if it is the police that gives the license, because it's just not something in our public discourse. It's just not something that is really, gun politics is not an issue in Britain because this is so rare. Um, in my entire lifetime, we've had four mass shootings in that's 35 years. So Hungerford 1987, Dunblane 1996, Cumbria 2010, and Plymouth 2021. We've had other violent incidents, we've had terrorist attacks, bombings, stabbings, but these sort of gun rampages are extremely rare in this country. That's very important to acknowledge. By contrast, look at the United States this year alone. Indianapolis, San Jose, Boulder, Colorado, and Atlanta. And that is just the worst mass shootings. I mean, there's hundreds of individual mass shootings. So I really don't think we should take any lectures from Second Amendment Americans on this. Anyway, I want to touch on an issue which I initially thought, okay, don't draw too much into this, it might not be linked. But it does look like the gunman, Jake Davison, was frequenting so-called incel community sites. And this is the main thing I want to talk about. Um, because this is potentially a dangerous situation. I think we might see other similar incidents. Maybe not necessarily with guns, but we might see other violent incidents. Um, Basically, around the world in recent years, there have been incidents, atrocities, involving young men who are bitter with the world, they're lonely, and they're extremely misogynistic in their outlook. Um, Perhaps the most famous example of this is Elliot Rogers in Isla Vista, California, in 2014 when he shot, I believe, six, seven people. Um, then there was the Toronto van rampage, and only last month in Tokyo, a man went on a knife rampage on the metro system there. And Tokyo is a very safe city. So clearly there is something going on here. In all these cases, and in Plymouth, all the perpetrators were angry men, primarily young men, who feel that their solitude, their loneliness, and their lack of sexual intimacy can be blamed on women. Um, and I'm not going to give a big, lengthy analysis of how exactly this began. There's different theories. One of them is it was, I forget the guy's name now, but he was a so-called pickup coach who fed young men this very problematic narrative that they were entitled basically. I forget the guy's name, but there was some reflections that that is how it started. And he, as I gather, has distanced himself from this more hardline misogynistic community that is online. So basically, what you get is these sort of online forums, which are echo chambers, because it's basically confirmation bias. I'm lonely. I've got no experience with women, so I hate the world, and I particularly hate women. It's their fault. And this is very dangerous because it dehumanizes women. Um, although having said that, that doesn't stop these atrocities, including male victims. It's not like they only target women. Remember, half the victims in Plymouth were male. Um, and it's probably true of the other incidents as well. But what is a characteristic of these sort of sites is that these young men are being fed this idea, and it's kind of a collective peer thing because they all fuel each other, from what I gather. Incidentally, the report I initially saw on Yahoo News was a female reporter, and she said that she entered this world. Well, in order to do that, she would have had to use a male pseudonym in order to get in there. I don't know if these sort of sites, I imagine these sites would be by invitation only or by password only or something like that. But clearly, it's a very unhealthy vacuum. Um, but I come from a sort of perspective on this, and I really want to be careful how I say this because let me be clear. What happened in Plymouth, what happened in Toronto, in Isla Vista, these atrocities are just that, they're atrocities. And there's absolutely no justification, zero justification for these appalling acts. I think if any of these perpetrators survive, they should spend many years behind bars. It's an evil thing to do. Um, I mean, it's pretty much it's no better than terrorism, and arguably it is a form of terrorism since it's ideologically motivated. There might be a case that what happened in Plymouth was an act of domestic terrorism. The issue around terrorism versus mass murder is terrorism involves a specific ideology, whereas mass murder might be a grudge against one's co-workers or relatives, as has often been the case in the United States. Now, we know that one of this guy's victims was his own mother. So, is it terrorism in the same way as, for example, a jihadist or far-right group that might randomly attack the public? I don't know. That's perhaps for another debate. But what I want to talk about is this incel mentality. Because I see two approaches, and I think both approaches, or rather both responses, are very, very misguided and will definitely not help the problem. And I've just said that I think if these perpetrators survived their attack, that i.e. they don't take their own life, they should serve many years behind bars. It's an evil thing to do. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and look at what is going on here and stop these young men, well, becoming radicalized. Because essentially that's what it is. So, those two responses that I'm talking about, on one hand, you will get a lot of people, particularly guys, it has to be said, who will say, oh, these losers are, let's laugh at them. They're losers, they're bitter, and this is what they do. So the response is, let's just laugh at them. Well, that actually taps into a wider social mentality, particularly in the West, which is that sexual experience is a huge amount of expectation, particularly on young men, but young women as well. And you see this. You get this dynamic where you get a group of young guys, and they're being really alpha male. They're in the pub, or they're doing whatever they're doing, and let's say one of them is deemed to have not had experience. Well, then it's a case of let's laugh at the virgin. Or it might not necessarily be in that friend dynamic, so-called friend dynamic. It might be in a more generic bullying sense of let's give this guy a hard time because he might be a virgin. Um, and girls get bullied as well. A girl who's deemed to not have had boyfriends, she's laughed at, she's ridiculed. So I think there's a very toxic mentality in Western society of partly peer pressure, but also a perspective that a lack of sexual experience somehow makes someone a loser or a weird person. rather than considering people just have different opportunities and confidence levels and a whole range of other factors. There's a range of reasons why people might not have had experience at, you know, what might be considered a normal age. That's the thing. I mean, you know, let's say mid-20s onwards, people start thinking, oh, that's quite late. Look at that film, The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Um, so in Western society, there's this real stigma over being deemed to be a virgin over your mid-20s. And I think that is something that needs to be explored, because I think it is going to have a very, very harmful impact on people who are going through that solitude. Because let's face it, when sexual intimacy is a basic human desire, I don't think it's a bad or immoral thing. What person wouldn't want sex at some point in their life? Okay, you have some people who are kind of asexual and it's genuinely not a big thing for them, but that's a relatively small number of people. For most people, sexual desire is a totally natural human desire. Let's just be honest about that. It is. So if you're in a position where you're not getting that experience, and it seems everyone else is, it is going to create a deep amount of loneliness and mental anguish. It is. And I think just laughing at people in that position, I think it's disgusting actually, because they're already dealing with the loneliness that comes from that. So laughing at them on top of that, it's just very cruel. But it's just, I see these guys or women who are in their mind very experienced and they think they're better than another person because, oh, I've had a dozen women or I've been with loads of guys. Feminists will say, of course, women are more stigmatized than men are. But either way, the notion of having more experience versus having no experience, there's a dynamic there. Of course, there's people who have no experience from choice due to religious reasons. That's where the involuntary celibacy thing comes in, because the whole point about this is these young men are they're not virgins by choice. For whatever reason, they just haven't had experience. And like I say, it could be a lack of confidence. It could be that they feel they're not attractive enough, which is getting into the lack of confidence factor. It could be just social opportunities. Maybe it's financial restraints. Because if you have limited financial means, you can't exactly go out on dates. You can't go out for dinner dates. You can't even pay for dating websites. You can't even pay for a sex worker. So the financial limitations is a big thing, and then it's a vicious cycle because they get depressed on the lack of intimacy, and the answer to that is maybe to get more stable, but the depression kills that motivation. So it's all a cycle. So that's one outlook, which is that, oh, they're just, let's just laugh at them, they're losers, and I think it's a very very bad outlook. The other one is from feminists who will look at this and they'll say, well, this is extreme misogyny. It's a problem and let's address it. To which I respond, yeah, you're right. Let's address it. It is extreme misogyny because they're blaming women for the problems. But where I would differ from those feminists is they're only looking at that and they're only looking at the punishment factor without sort of considering source of this. Now, like I say, after the fact, or when a guy is showing clearly misogynistic tendencies, he should be condemned. He should be called out on it. But I think you have these two sort of approaches of ridicule and condemnation. Both of them are not going to help the problem. They're not. And at this point, I'm going to get a little bit personal. It goes without saying, I've never, moved to that way of thinking to ever blame women for, any shortcomings I've had. I am very critical of third wave feminism for the double standards, but I've never blamed feminists or women for problems that I have in life. Um, Now the problem here is these young men. think that their lack of intimacy is the fault of women. And there's an entitlement mentality there. I mentioned earlier that sexual desire is a very human thing. I don't think anyone should be faulted or made to feel guilty about that. But there's something called consent. And that factor, this sense of entitlement. I mean, the troubling thing about these sites is they're justifying sexual assault, they're justifying rape. That's potentially very dangerous. Um, so, what's the answer? Well, I would say that social media companies have a responsibility to act against this, and maybe they should just shut the sites down. I don't know what platforms they're using. I would imagine it's unlikely to be Facebook. I'd imagine they're more obscure websites. Um, but and you know they have their whole own terminology about being blackpilled, i.e., they've tried to write red pill these analogies with Matrix, and that didn't work. And then they saw the world for what it really is. Gymax apparently means some guys might have the opportunity to go to the gym and work out and get in shape. But for some of them, obviously for Jake Davison, and he was only 22 years old, his worldview would have been so bleak that he thought the only solution was to commit an atrocity and then take his own life on top of it. I mean, what depth of hatred and loneliness must it take at 22 years old to do that? So this is something that needs to be taken seriously. One thought I had, and I don't think this, I would simply ask people consider this. These young men don't trust women and they hate women, which is awful. And they need to be radicalized from that way of thinking. Uh, but maybe the way to do that, Len, is for men not to ridicule them, not to shame them, but maybe to mentor them. You know, maybe that is what needs to happen here. So if a young guy is showing signs of extreme misogyny, if he's showing signs of gravitating towards these sites, I was going to say, if social media companies just shut them down, the problem then is they get even more, the world's against them, and I'm not sure that would necessarily work. I mean, I think there's a strong moral argument to do it. I just don't think it would be practically necessarily effective because it won't change their bitterness, it won't change their misogyny. So, what these young guys need is some sort of vacuum to get away from that way of thinking. And as for the practical problem, the primary issue that they're angry about, that they're not getting intimacy, well, there's issues there. There's confidence. There is opportunities, you know. Um, Maybe those are things that need to be explored. In what way can they be given opportunities to maybe find someone? But as a starting point, they need to change their mindset that everything should be blamed on women because, there's no point sort of getting someone confidence if they are just going to have a misogynistic and entitled mentality. In that case, they might get a partner, but they'll abuse her. So I think there's different ways to look at this, but I honestly think that having some sort of mentor program shouldn't be ridiculed or dismissed. It might be a practical way forward. But like I say, in no way am I trying to justify what's happened. And I do think after the fact, if someone commits this sort of carnage and they survive, they should serve the rest of their life in prison. There's absolutely no caveat for that. Now, in the possibility that you are a guy and you're maybe sympathetic to this worldview, maybe you've been visiting the sites, maybe you think, yes, I relate to that. Please, please, please step back because those sites and that worldview, if you think life is hard by not having intimacy, going to those sites will ruin your life completely. True story. I was at university. I was in my early 20s. There's some very beautiful, attractive women there. You know, I felt very lonely, very lonely. I felt I couldn't get why I wasn't having success. I was polite. I treated women well. I didn't get it. And yeah, I was angry at times, not with women, situation. Um, but subsequently, I'm 35 now, and I'm not going to make out I've had massive experience, but I've had significant experience since then. And had I given up in my early 20s, I would never have got the experiences I did because those experiences came unexpectedly. I had girlfriends, I had relationships. Those experiences came unexpectedly. So you might think I'm not good looking, I've no money, I'm a loser, I hate the world, but you have to step back a little bit. Okay, so let's say you're overweight, go to the gym. Let's say you're not the best looking guy. Look at me, I'm hardly Brad Pitt, right? You might not be the best looking guy, but believe it or not, women aren't just interested in looks, they're not. Um, Also consider, if you're blaming women and you hate women, consider lonely young women. They're affected as well. Don't you think it's hard for them not being able to find a boyfriend, not being able to find a partner? So you need to really, really push yourself to change this entitled mentality. But for God's sake, if you go down that path, it will ruin your life. Please, please, please step back. Don't blame women. You might have had a rejection. You might have even dealt with a rude person. Well, that's her. That's not all womankind. Okay? If you've maybe had experience with a woman who was rude to you, or she was cruel in terms of whatever it might be, okay, that's not cool. Maybe you were stood up. That's a shitty thing to do. But don't blame half the human race. Believe me, there are a lot of good women out there. There really are. But if you have this mentality, I hate women, then you can't really complain if women turn around and say, what sort of guy are you? So you really, really need to change this way of looking at all women as one and the same. I'm going to round this up, but I really think that this problem needs to be taken seriously because that's what's happening. You get these guys who are going to these sites, they're bitter, they're angry, they're lonely. I've been there, I've been lonely. I know what that is like. But those sites are going to mislead you if you happen to be one of those guys. And, you know, are you really prepared to take other people's lives? Are you really prepared to destroy extended lives for people's families? Men as well? This is horrendous. Jake Davison was not a hero. He was an angry young man who done a terrible, evil thing. That's what he was. Do you want that to be your legacy? So please step back. And as for those who think, okay, let's just take the piss out of the virgins, it might be a big laugh to you, but um, personally, I think that's a scummy thing to do because it's extremely cruel. It's to me, it's disgusting. It's one of the ugliest forms of bullying, in my opinion. Um, but I'm not saying, by the way, if someone gets mocked for being a virgin, that justifies them doing a terrible thing. Of course not. But bullying is also a terrible thing, and it can cost lives when we consider suicide. The loneliness and the mental anguish that you might be putting people through, or exasperating when you just take the piss in that way, um, just don't do it. And to feminists, I would say I agree with you. Your analysis that this is extreme misogyny. It is, but simply shaming and condemning them won't change them either. Um, there is a potential that they can maybe reflect on themselves because not all of these guys. I've seen some of these mentalities. I haven't been to any of the sites, obviously, but I have seen some of the mentalities of guys who go to those sites, and in some cases they're confused, they're uncertain, and there is a kind of moral side there that is weighing back and thinking, oh, I know it's wrong, or I know. So there is some hope that they can be de-radicalized. But I think honestly that's what we have to call it. It is radicalization because they're being influenced by these sites. That all the problems they have is the fault of women. It's a very toxic thing. Um, don't blame half the human race. I mean, I'm sure you guys don't like it when feminists, generalize men. But what are you doing? So, that's all I would say. Let me know your thoughts. But I really, really do think that some sort of mentoring program might be an answer to this. Obviously, if someone's broken the law or they're expressing extreme misogyny, they should be condemned. But I am saying that condemning them alone won't solve the problem, and certainly not ridiculing them.